Jack could feel it before he saw it. A shift in the air. A fracture in the balance. He stood in the celestial plane, bathed in golden light, surrounded by the quiet hum of divinity. He should have felt peace. Should have felt the weight of his mortal burdens lifted. But there was only emptiness. And then, the light trembled. A deep, unnatural chill rolled through the heavens, sending ripples through the golden expanse. Jack's hands clenched at his sides. The other angels felt it too. He could see the way they turned, murmuring among themselves, confusion slipping into unease. Something was wrong. Then, a voice. Sharp. Uncertain. He has risen. Jack's breath caught. His heart, his human heart, the one he wasn't supposed to have anymore, stuttered in his chest. He didn't need to ask who they meant. Edward. No. It wasn't possible. He had felt the life leave him, had held him as his body stilled. He had done what was necessary. He had ended it. Hadn't he? The heavens trembled again. This time, it wasn't just a shift. It was a crack. Then came the scream. Not from above. From below. It started as a whisper, low, guttural, vibrating through the air. Then it built into something unholy, a sound that had no place in the celestial plane. A wretched, agonized wail of something being reborn through suffering. The golden sky darkened, the light fraying at its edges. Something was clawing its way up. Jack's pulse thundered in his ears. Edward wasn't just alive. He was coming. The world split open. Jack stood on the edge of the highest gate, staring down at the rupture in reality itself. Below, the mortal realm was not as it should be. The sky burned an unnatural red, the air thick with a power that did not belong to demons or angels. It was something worse. Something that had once been Edward. Jack barely recognized him. The last time he had seen Edward, he had been bleeding out in his arms, golden eyes filled with hurt and betrayal. Now, those eyes were black voids, rimmed with flickering crimson light. His body radiated a darkness that moved like shadows given life, curling around him like unseen chains. His lips parted, and when he spoke, his voice was different, low, layered, not entirely human. You left me. Jack's breath hitched. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words stuck in his throat. Edward's head tilted, slow and unnatural. He was studying him. Like something unfamiliar. Like something he had once loved and now despised. Was it easy for you? Edward took a step forward. The earth beneath him cracked with the weight of his power. Did you wash the blood from your hands and ascend without regret? Jack couldn't lie. He had regretted it every day. I did what I had to. Jack forced the words out, though they tasted bitter. Edward stilled. Then, he smiled. A slow, unnerving, cruel smile. Good, he murmured. Then, he struck. Jack barely had time to react before the heavens themselves screamed. Darkness surged up, swallowing the light, warping the sacred realm into something twisted and wrong. Edward's shadows lashed out, slamming into Jack's chest, sending him hurtling backward. Pain. Real pain. Jack gasped as he hit the marble floor of the celestial plane, his back arching from the impact. He hadn't felt pain since he had ascended. But now, Edward had made him feel it. Edward stalked toward him, slow, deliberate. The air thickened, pressure crushing in around them. You don't belong here, Jack rasped. Edward's blackened eyes gleamed. Neither do you. Then, the shadows dragged Jack down. Falling. Jack had fallen once before, but that time, he had been rising. Now, he was plummeting. Edward's power wrapped around him, twisting, suffocating, tearing through the celestial bonds that had once held him in the heavens. Jack struggled, but it was useless. Edward was stronger. He was no longer part demon. He was something else entirely. Jack crashed into the mortal realm with a force that shattered stone. Pain lanced through him, every nerve screaming. He barely had time to register the agony before Edward was on him, slamming a boot against his chest, pinning him down. Jack coughed, the taste of blood sharp in his mouth. He was bleeding. He had made Edward bleed once, too. Edward crouched over him, expression unreadable. He could kill him now. He could end it. But he didn't. Instead, he whispered, I want you to understand what it feels like to lose everything. Jack's body trembled beneath him. Edward. But Edward leaned closer, his breath hot against Jack's ear. "You don't get to say my name anymore." Then, the shadows dragged Jack away. And for the first time since his betrayal, Jack was afraid. Jack awoke to darkness. It was not the comforting shadow of night, nor the emptiness of sleep. This was something deeper, something alive. It pressed against him, thick and suffocating, curling around his limbs like unseen chains. He tried to move. Pain. Sharp, searing, his wrists burned as he pulled, metal biting into his skin. He was bound. Shackles of blackened iron pinned his arms above his head, attached to a stone wall slick with moisture. Jack's breathing was ragged. His angelic grace, once an ever-present warmth, was gone, ripped from him the moment Edward had dragged him from the heavens. He was something less now. Something mortal. A voice, low and edged with amusement, echoed from the darkness. "Welcome back." Jack's heart stuttered. A soft glow flickered to life in front of him, not fire, not holy light, but something twisted. Shadows curled at the edges, forming tendrils of writhing energy, pulsing in time with a steady, controlled heartbeat. Edward. Jack's breath hitched as the figure stepped forward, emerging from the darkness like a predator slipping from the void. His golden eyes were gone, replaced with bottomless black, rimmed with flickering crimson. His once familiar smirk now held something cold beneath it, something unreadable. His form was the same, still Edward, still lean and strong, but the air around him hummed with unnatural power. The very world seemed to bend to his presence, shadows curling at his feet, waiting for his command. Edward tilted his head slightly, eyes tracing over Jack's restrained form with something close to curiosity. "They stripped your divinity quickly." Jack swallowed hard, throat dry. He forced his voice steady. "You didn't give them much of a choice." Edward hummed in amusement. He took another step closer, slow, deliberate. The dim light illuminated the jagged scar across his chest, right where Jack's blade had pierced him. A scar that shouldn't be there. Jack's stomach twisted. Edward should have healed completely. Whatever he had become, it was not divine. It was something beyond healing, beyond purity, beyond the natural order. Edward followed his gaze, then smirked. "Ah." He reached up, fingers tracing the scar lazily. "A reminder. One I don't intend to forget." Jack clenched his jaw. "Is that why I'm here?" He forced himself to meet Edward's gaze. "You want me to suffer? To make me beg?" Edward's smirk didn't fade. "Would you?" Jack refused to look away. "Never." Edward laughed, soft, amused, but wrong. The sound of it sent chills down Jack's spine. "That's the Jack I remember." He reached forward, slow and calculated, his fingers brushing over Jack's jaw, tilting his chin up. The ever-righteous soldier. Jack should have pulled away. Should have resisted. But his body betrayed him, breath hitching at the contact. Edward noticed. His fingers drifted lower, tracing the line of Jack's throat, stopping just above his racing pulse. His touch was cold, yet Jack swore he felt something burning beneath it. A slow, dangerous smile tugged at Edward's lips. "I wonder," he murmured, "if you're afraid of me now." Jack exhaled sharply. "I'm not." Edward's smile widened. "Liar." Jack was afraid. Not of dying. Not of pain. He was afraid because some part of him had missed this. Edward leaned in, voice a whisper against his ear. "You left me in the dirt to die, Jack. Do you know what that felt like?" Jack's hands curled into fists against his restraints. "I know." His voice was rough. Pained. "I know." Edward pulled back just enough to look at him, blackened eyes scanning his face for something. Some reaction. Some weakness. For a moment, the tension between them shifted, not rage, not hatred, but something else. And then, Edward's fingers tightened around Jack's throat. Not enough to choke him. But enough to remind him that he could. Edward's expression darkened. "You don't get to know what it feels like." Then he let go. Jack gasped for air, chest rising and falling as Edward stepped back, shadows curling around his form. "You will break," Edward murmured. "Not today. But soon." He turned, already disappearing into the darkness. "And when you do? Maybe then, you'll understand." The cell door slammed shut. And Jack was alone. Jack lost track of time in the darkness. The stone walls never changed. The shackles never loosened. There was no day, no night, just the steady, oppressive presence of Edward's power lingering around him, pressing into his bones, wearing him down. And Edward. Edward never let him forget. Sometimes it was silence, an unbearable, suffocating quiet that stretched for hours, days, maybe longer. Other times, Edward would visit, his footsteps slow, deliberate, his voice curling around Jack like the shadows that followed him. "Are you ready to beg yet?" Jack never answered. But the longer he was here, the more he felt the truth unraveling inside him. The heavens had abandoned him. His grace was gone. And Edward was the only thing left. The worst part wasn't the pain. The worst part was that Jack didn't hate him. He should. He wanted to. But every time Edward got close, so close Jack could feel the cold press of his power against his skin, could hear the steady, unshaken rhythm of his breath, it wasn't just hatred burning inside him. It was something else. Something that had never died, even after Jack's blade had torn through Edward's heart. Jack didn't know how long it had been when Edward finally changed the rules. No shadows. No chains. Just Edward and Jack. Face to face. The shackles vanished, and Jack fell forward, barely catching himself before hitting the ground. His arms screamed in protest, weak from disuse. He hadn't realized how much he had relied on the restraints to hold him up. Edward stood before him, arms crossed, watching. Jack swallowed, forcing himself to stand. His body was wrecked, starved, exhausted, but he wouldn't kneel. Not to him. Edward's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Then, he gestured to the door. "Go." Jack frowned. His throat was dry when he spoke. "What?" Edward's smirk was slow, deliberate. "You're free." Jack stared at him, waiting for the trick, the hidden blade, the strike that never came. Edward only lifted a brow. "Isn't this what you wanted?" Jack took a breath. "No." Edward's expression flickered. He had expected Jack to run. He had wanted him to. Wanted him to prove that he was still the same man who had betrayed him. But Jack wasn't. Not anymore. He took a slow step forward, watching as Edward tensed, shadows curling instinctively at his feet. Jack's voice was rough but sure. "I want to fix this." Edward scoffed, turning away. "There's nothing to fix." Jack moved before he could stop himself. His fingers caught Edward's wrist, pulling him back. The moment they touched, power surged between them, sharp, electric, something neither of them understood. Edward's breath hitched. He didn't pull away. Jack tightened his grip. "You didn't kill me when you had the chance." Edward's jaw clenched. "Shut up." Jack stepped closer. "You didn't kill me, Edward. You broke me, but you didn't end me." His voice dropped, softer now. "And I think I know why." Edward's chest rose and fell, his expression unreadable. The air between them was thick with something dangerous, something fragile and raw. Then, finally, Edward broke. His lips crashed against Jack's, desperate, angry, hungry. Jack gasped into the kiss, his hands tangling into Edward's hair, pulling him closer. The shadows around them flickered, uncertain. Edward's power wavered, not in weakness, but in surrender. For the first time since his rebirth, Edward felt human. The kiss deepened, hard and breathless, filled with everything they had lost, everything they had ruined. When they finally pulled apart, Edward's voice was barely a whisper. "I hate you." Jack's thumb brushed against his jaw, gentle, grounding. "No, you don't." Edward exhaled shakily. His hands were still fisted in Jack's shirt, holding on like letting go might break him all over again. Jack's forehead pressed against his. "We can end this. But not like this." Edward's eyes burned. "Then how?" Jack swallowed. "Together." And for the first time since his betrayal, Edward didn't feel alone. The battle that followed shook the heavens themselves. Edward turned his wrath on the celestial plane, but this time, Jack fought beside him. Not as enemies. Not as betrayer and betrayed. But as something new. Jack tore through the angels that had used him, the ones who had whispered commands into his ear and sent him to destroy the only person he had ever loved. Edward unleashed his power, not in vengeance, but in freedom. By the time the sky cleared, the war was over. The heavens lay fractured. Edward stood at its gates, free, but unwilling to enter. Jack turned to him. What now? Edward's blackened eyes met his. We leave. Jack exhaled, a slow, tired smile tugging at his lips. Together? Edward hesitated, just for a moment. Then, he took Jack's hand. And together, they stepped into the unknown. The end.